They called her a monster. Doctors measured her skull. Crowds paid to stare at her. Scientists argued whether she was human at all. But here's the part no one tells you. For more than 150 years, even after she died, her body was still owned, displayed, and argued over, passed from one country to another like a forgotten object. Her name was Julia Pastrana. She could sing in multiple languages. She could dance on stage under gaslight. She could read and write at a time when most women could not. And yet the world decided she was something less than human. This is not a horror story. This is not a circus tale. This is not a myth. This really happened. And the most disturbing part isn't what they did to her while she was alive. It's what they refused to stop doing after she was dead. Stay with me. Because once you hear how this story ends, you'll never look at the word civilized the same way again. The church bells began to ring just as the sun slipped behind the red clay rooftops of the small town in Sinaloa. Not the urgent bells that call the living. Not the joyful ones that celebrate beginnings. These bells were slow, heavy, deliberate. Each sound lingered in the air longer than it should have, as if the town itself hesitated to let it fade. It was the sound of endings, the sound reserved for things that have traveled too far, for too long, to ever fully return. A narrow road led toward the church, illuminated by oil lamps and flickering candles. Their weak yellow light spilled onto cracked earth, stretching shadows across the ground, long, thin silhouettes that looked less like people and more like memories trying to stand upright. A small procession moved forward in silence. No one hurried. No one spoke loudly. Every step was careful, restrained, as if a single careless movement might disturb something fragile and unseen. At the center of the procession was a simple wooden coffin, unpainted, unadorned, ordinary in every way. The kind of coffin that had carried generations of farmers, mothers, and forgotten souls into this same dry soil. But the woman inside it was not ordinary, not to the world that had once claimed her. She had left this land nearly 2 centuries earlier. Her name was engraved on a modest plaque resting atop the coffin. No titles, no descriptions, no cruel labels, none of the names the world had invented for her. Printed on posters, written in medical journals, whispered in crowded halls. Just 2 words: Julia Pastrana. The air smelled of damp earth and late winter blossoms. Orange trees nearby carried a faint sweetness, mixing with the scent of dust and time itself. A smell that exists only in places where history has settled heavily into the ground. People gathered quietly in the churchyard. Some came out of curiosity. Others because they had been told this was not an ordinary burial. Many could not have explained why they were there at all, only that something in them insisted they should be. Elderly women stood wrapped in black shawls, fingers moving slowly over worn rosaries that had passed through generations. Men removed their hats as the coffin passed, not out of recognition, but out of instinct. Something about this moment demanded respect, even if its meaning remained unclear. This was not a funeral for someone they knew. It was a funeral for someone they were only beginning to understand. The priest stood at the steps of the church, his voice low and steady, carried gently by the desert wind. He did not speak of spectacle. He did not mention stages, or crowds, or laboratories, or the many cities where Julia Pastrana had been stared at, measured, and debated. Instead, he spoke of dignity. He spoke of home. He spoke of the earth beneath their feet, the same earth that had received countless unknown lives and would now receive one that the world had refused to forget, even in death. As the prayer ended, the procession moved again. There was no music, no marching band, No ceremonial display, only the soft scuff of shoes against dust. The whisper of wind threading through mesquite branches, and the faint scent of fresh flowers laid carefully atop the coffin. White lilies, wild daisies, a few roses taken from a nearby courtyard that morning. Simple flowers, the kind people usually walk past without noticing. Dogs barked once in the distance, then fell quiet. Even they seemed to sense the weight of the hour. The cemetery lay at the edge of town, where the land thinned into open space. The soil there was dry, but forgiving. It had welcomed many who left no stories behind, people whose names had never traveled farther than the reach of their own lives. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, the wind stilled. For a brief moment, everything paused. Breath, sound, movement. It was as if the land itself leaned closer. Listening, then the shovel struck the earth. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound of soil hitting wood spread quietly through the crowd. Not sharp, not violent, just final. With that sound, a journey that had lasted more than 150 years came to an end. But the story did not. Stories rarely end at graves. They begin there, where silence gathers, and questions finally dare to rise. Who was Julia Pastrana before the world named her something else? Before she became an object, a curiosity, a debate? As night settled over the town, candles were extinguished one by one. Smoke curled upward into the cooling air like threads of memory unraveling. The people began to leave. Footsteps soft, voices hushed. The earth closed over the coffin. And somewhere beneath that soil, a woman who had been denied rest for generations was finally allowed to be still. The crowd did not disperse immediately, even after the coffin had been lowered, even after the final prayer faded into the cooling air. People lingered, standing in small clusters, unsure of what to do with their hands, their eyes, their thoughts. This was not the kind of funeral where grief arrives fully formed. It was quieter than that. Stranger. Most of them had never heard the name Julia Pastrana until recently. Some had read it online. Others had seen it mentioned briefly on the news. A woman who had been buried far away. A body returned. A story recovered. But stories, when stripped of detail, leave behind a hollow curiosity. Children stood on their toes, trying to glimpse inside the grave. Though there was nothing to see, the coffin remained sealed, as if the past itself had finally agreed to stay closed. A few adults gently pulled the children back, not with anger, but with an unease they could not fully explain. An elderly woman stood apart from the others near the edge of the cemetery. Her hair was silver and thin, gathered beneath a black scarf embroidered with fading thread. She leaned on a wooden cane polished smooth by years of use. Her eyes remained fixed on the mound of fresh earth. She remembered hearing stories when she was young, not facts. Stories. They were told in half sentences, in lowered voices, usually at night when lamps burned low and adults believed children were not listening. A woman with a face covered in hair. A girl who danced far away in cities that sounded unreal. A name that drifted through conversation like a rumor rather than a memory. Back then, it had felt like folklore, like something that belonged to another world entirely. But now, standing here, watching soil settle over a grave, the story felt uncomfortably real. The bells rang again, slower this time, their sound stretching across the open land beyond the cemetery. Each note followed the last like footsteps down a corridor that never quite ends. A priest murmured a final blessing. his words carried away by the wind before they could fully settle. No one applauded. No one cried out. Respect took the shape of silence. Men placed their hats back onto their heads. Women adjusted their shawls. One by one, people turned away, walking back toward the town where dinner waited, where life would continue without interruption. The world rarely pauses for long. As the crowd thinned, the old woman stepped closer to the grave. From beneath her shawl, she removed a small bundle tied with twine, dried herbs, sage, perhaps, or something similar. She placed them gently on the earth, pressing them down with care. No one asked her why. No one needed to. A stray dog wandered into the cemetery and lay down near the fence, curling itself into the dirt as if it belonged there. Crickets began their nightly chorus, filling the air with a sound that had not changed in centuries. The moon rose slowly over the distant mountains, pale and indifferent, exactly as it had been on the night Julia Pastrana was born, nearly 200 years earlier. Night settled fully now. Candles were extinguished. Smoke drifted upward, thin and fragile, dissolving into darkness like thoughts left unfinished. The cemetery emptied until only the sound of insects and the soft movement of wind through mesquite branches remained. It was quiet again, but not empty, because even as the earth closed over her, the questions remained. Who was Julia Pastrana before the world decided what she was? Before strangers measured her worth with rulers and words? Before her body became a debate instead of a home? The town of Sinaloa returned to its routines. Doors closed, lamps dimmed. Somewhere, a radio played softly through an open window. Somewhere else, a child asked a question an adult did not know how to answer, and beneath the soil at the edge of town, a woman who had spent most of her existence being seen, truly seen for the first time only in death, lay in stillness. But stillness does not erase memory. If anything, it sharpens it, because it is often only at the end of a journey that the meaning of its beginning becomes clear. And Julia Pastrana's story did not begin with a stage, or a laboratory, or a newspaper headline. It began far from here, in a place where the air was thick with humidity and birdsong, where rivers moved slowly and children ran barefoot through dirt paths, where no one yet knew how to turn a human life into a spectacle. The wind moved again through the cemetery, lifting a thin veil of dust before letting it fall back to the ground. Beyond the graves, beyond the town, beyond the roads that led away from this place, the land stretched out toward the river that bent near Santiago de Ocoroni. And it was there, long before bells rang, long before crowds gathered, that Julia Pastrana first drew breath. That is where her story truly begins. The wind that moved through the cemetery that night did not stop there. It drifted beyond the iron fence, past the narrow road, past the low fields where the soil cracked under the weight of the sun. It followed the curve of the land the way it had always done, patient, indifferent, unhurried, until it reached the place where the river bends near Santiago de Ocoroni, long before the town had a name written on maps. The river was already there. It moved slowly, carrying silt and stories through the valley. Reeds leaned into its current. Nightbirds nested along its banks. In the early 19th century, the village that clung to this river was little more than a cluster of clay houses, scattered fires, and dirt paths worn smooth by bare feet. Life here did not announce itself loudly. Roosters crowed before dawn. Dogs slept through the heat of midday. At night, the world softened under the sound of insects and the low murmur of water moving through darkness. Outsiders rarely came this way, and those who did often left quickly, complaining of the humidity, the isolation, the slowness of everything. Time moved differently here. It was into this quiet corner of northern Mexico that Julia Pastrana was born, in the year 1834. There was no ceremony, no official record, no written announcement, just a small room lit by candles, the smell of sweat and damp earth, and a midwife whose hands had delivered countless children before this one. When the child emerged, the room fell into an unfamiliar silence. Her body was small, fragile, warm, like any newborn, but her skin was covered in fine, dark hair that caught the candlelight as she was lifted into view. Her jaw was broad, her gums pronounced, details that would later be measured and argued over by men who had never stood in a room like this. She cried, a thin, insistent cry that filled the space and pushed against the walls as if to announce, unmistakably, that she was alive. The women crossed themselves. The midwife whispered a prayer under her breath, whether of protection or fear. No one could later say, outside. The river continued its slow, steady voice, utterly unmoved by what the world would one day decide this child represented in the weeks that followed. Julia's mother wrapped her tightly in woven cloth and held her close. It is said she sang softly at night, songs passed down by women whose names were never written anywhere, songs meant to calm infants and steady the heart, songs that disappear the moment no one remembers them. But villages are small ecosystems. Whispers travel faster than wind. A child who looks different does not remain unnoticed for long. At first, the comments were cautious, curious, then they sharpened. Some said the child was touched by the mountains. Others said she carried the shadow of an old spirit. A few simply looked away, pretending not to see at all. Someone, no one ever agreed who, spoke the first name that was not hers, and once a name is spoken, it rarely stays alone. Stories began to bend and grow. A strange star seen the night she was born, an owl calling 3 times, a sign, an omen. Small details layered into something heavier with every retelling. But Julia knew none of this. She knew the texture of her mother's shawl, the smell of corn cooking over open fire, the taste of river water cupped in her hands. She learned to walk along the dirt paths, her feet pressing into soil warmed by the sun. She followed goats through scrubland. She laughed, freely, loudly, the way children do before they learn which parts of themselves the world will not forgive. There are fragments of memory, passed down decades later, that describe her as curious and quick. She mimicked birdsong. She whistled to stray dogs. She delighted in sound and language, even before she could fully shape words. But difference does not fade with familiarity. As Julia grew, the glances lingered longer. Adults lowered their voices when she passed. Children learned how to stare, and sometimes how to laugh. By watching their parents, laughter, even quiet laughter, leaves marks that time does not easily erase. At night, when the heat softened and the insects filled the air, her mother would sometimes carry her outside. They would sit beneath the open sky, the river whispering nearby. It is said her mother pointed upward and told her that each star was an ancestor watching over them. Whether that was true or not no longer matters. What matters is that Julia learned early how to look at something vast without fear. The seasons passed without drama. The river rose and fell. Julia's hair grew thicker, darker. Her features became more defined. Some villagers offered her fruit as if unsure whether she was a blessing or a curse. Others crossed themselves when she approached. Acceptance and suspicion lived side by side. There are many versions of what came next. Some say her uncle resented the burden she brought. Others say her mother loved her fiercely and tried to protect her. Some claim Julia was sold. Others insist she was taken. History, when it concerns the powerless, rarely offers clean answers. What remains certain is this. There was a time, brief, fragile, and easily forgotten, when Julia Pastrana belonged only to the river, the land, and the quiet rhythm of village life, before contracts, before stages, before the world learned how to profit from her existence. And on one night, when the moon rose pale over the fields and the wind moved gently through the reeds, a knock sounded at the door of their small home, a knock that would change the direction of her life forever. The river did not stop flowing, the stars did not fall, but from that moment on, Julia Pastrana's story would no longer belong to the place where it began. The knock on the door was not loud. It did not carry urgency. It did not demand attention. It was the kind of knock that could easily be ignored, soft, measured, polite, the kind that arrives disguised as nothing important at all. But in small villages, nothing arrives without meaning. Julia's mother hesitated before opening the door. The night air pressed inward as the wooden panels creaked apart. Outside stood a man she did not recognize. His clothes were dusty, his hat worn thin at the edges. He smiled in a way that suggested familiarity without actually offering it. He said he was only passing through. Travelers often said that. He spoke of work, of opportunity, of places beyond the river where life moved differently, faster, cleaner, richer. He spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded generous without ever becoming specific. And then, almost as an afterthought, he asked about the child, not by name, just the child. By the next morning, the village knew. It always did. Whispers moved through Santiago de Ocoroni like smoke slipping between doors and windows. A man had come asking questions. Someone had spoken of the girl. Someone else had exaggerated. Another had added a detail that had never existed. By nightfall, the story had already changed shape. She was no longer just a child with an unusual appearance. She became something rarer, stranger, more valuable. A curiosity hidden away in a forgotten corner of the country. A secret the world had not yet discovered. And secrets, once named, do not stay secret for long. Within weeks, the whispers traveled beyond the village. Carried by traders, by wandering laborers, by men who trafficked not only in goods, but in stories. Each retelling sharpened the edges. Each telling stripped away more of the truth. In distant towns, the story grew teeth. A wild child raised in caves. A girl descended from an unknown tribe. A woman not entirely human. None of them had seen her. None of them needed to. The lie was more useful than the truth. Back in Santiago de Ocoroni, Julia still followed her mother through daily life. She still sat by the fire at night, listening to songs with no written names. She still looked at the stars, tracing their slow movement across the sky. But the air around her had changed. Looks lingered longer. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Kindness became cautious. Her mother felt it most clearly. She had lived long enough to recognize the moment when a community begins to step back from its own, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of being connected to something the outside world might come looking for. One evening, two men arrived at the edge of the village. They came with a mule and a small cart. Nothing about them appeared threatening. Their voices were smooth, practiced. They spoke of education, of protection, of a future where the girl would not have to endure the looks and whispers of village life. They never said the word money. They didn't need to. Promises have weight, especially when options are few. No one recorded the conversation that followed. No one wrote down what was agreed upon or who decided what. Later, there would be arguments. Some would say Julia was sold. Others would insist she was taken for her own good. the truth, as it often does, lived somewhere between necessity and coercion. What mattered was this. One morning, Julia did not wake up in the house by the river. Her feet did not touch the familiar dirt path. Her hands did not dip into the cool water. The goats grazed without her watching. The house stood quiet. Neighbors passed by and pretended not to notice. In the larger towns, the story had already moved ahead of her, printed on cheap paper, spoken aloud in taverns and markets, a living marvel waiting to be revealed. By the time Julia's journey began, her image had already been shaped by strangers. She traveled north along roads that stretched endlessly beneath the sun. Nights were cold, mornings came pale and distant. She sat on wooden benches, wrapped in cloth, listening to voices she did not yet understand, discussing her as if she were cargo. She did not cry. She had learned, early on, the power of stillness. The further she moved from the river, the more the land changed. Scrub gave way to stone, stone to dust. The familiar sounds of insects and water were replaced by wheels, hooves, and voices that carried no warmth. At last, they reached a place unlike any she had known, a house built of stone, floors that echoed beneath footsteps, walls that held secrets instead of memories. This was the residence of the governor, and it was here, far from the river, far from the only home she had ever known, that Julia Pastrana's life would be reshaped once again. Not as a child of the land, but as something the world was already preparing to look at. The house of the governor did not smell like fear. That was the first thing Julia noticed. It smelled of polished wood, candle wax, ink, and paper. Clean smells, ordered smells, the kind of place where nothing appeared accidental. Thick stone walls kept the heat out. Windows were tall and narrow, allowing light to enter only in controlled lines. As if even sunlight had to obey rules here. Julia moved quietly through the halls. Servants passed her without comment, though their eyes lingered just long enough to acknowledge that she was different, not hostile, not kind, merely observant. In places like this, observation was a form of power. The governor, Pedro Sanchez, was a man accustomed to curiosities, travelers, merchants, soldiers, priests. He listened to them all with the same measured attention. By the time Julia arrived, he had already heard stories about her. Versions of her life had reached him long before her body did. Some framed her as a marvel, others as a puzzle, a few as an embarrassment hidden too long in the countryside. What he saw, when she stood before him, was none of those things. He saw a child standing very still, not defiant, not broken, alert. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask her questions in front of others. He simply instructed that she be housed, clothed, and, most importantly, educated. It was an unusual decision in that era. Education was rarely offered freely, and almost never to someone like Julia, but the governor believed in order, and order, to him, began with language. Books were brought, at first. They were strange objects, heavy, quiet, smelling of dust and ink. A maid showed Julia how to turn pages carefully. A tutor arrived in the afternoons, his voice patient, his movements precise. She learned letters by tracing them with her fingers before she ever learned to write them. She learned to pronounce words slowly, shaping sounds that felt foreign in her mouth. Spanish, formal and deliberate, replaced the rhythms of village speech. Language came to her easily, too easily. Some would later say, within months. She was reading aloud, her voice soft but steady. Within a year, she was writing her name, then sentences, then paragraphs. The governor took quiet satisfaction in this. Proof, perhaps, that the world was more orderly than people feared. But education is never neutral. While Julia learned words, others learned how to talk about her using them. Visitors to the house were told of her intelligence in the same breath as her appearance. Compliments were followed by pauses, admiration tangled with discomfort. "She is remarkably capable." Someone would say, "Yes, but..." Another would reply, the sentence rarely needed to be finished. At night, when the house settled into silence, Julia would sit by the window in her small room. She would run her fingers over the pages of books, even when she could not yet understand every word. The paper felt smooth, solid, real, unlike the looks. She began to understand something essential during those nights. That knowledge could give her a voice, but it could not decide whether others would listen. The governor treated her with a measured kindness. She was given work within the household, small tasks meant to teach responsibility rather than servitude. She ate regular meals. She slept in a clean bed, by every visible measure. She was safe, but safety has limits. She was not free to leave. She was not free to refuse visitors. She was not free to be unseen. Guests came who asked to meet her, not as one asks to meet a person, but as one asks to see an object mentioned in passing. Some were polite, some curious, some stared too long. Julia learned how to stand under that gaze without flinching. She learned how to answer questions clearly and calmly, denying others the satisfaction of seeing discomfort. Her words were careful, controlled. She never spoke more than necessary. Silence, she discovered, could be shaped. She began to sing again, not for visitors, not for approval, in quiet moments. She sang the songs her mother once hummed by the river, in the echoing rooms of the stone house. They sounded different, thinner, restrained, but they remained hers. She also listened to fragments of other languages carried by the governor's guests, to accents from distant places, to ideas spoken casually by men who believed knowledge was their exclusive domain. She absorbed them all. By the time she reached adulthood, Julia Pastrana was no longer just the child brought from a village by the river. She was articulate, observant, educated, and still. She was not allowed to forget how others saw her. It was during a gathering one evening, lanterns lit in the courtyard, voices layered with wine and confidence, that Julia heard the laughter. Not loud, not cruel, just amused. She did not turn. She did not react. When addressed, she answered in precise, elegant Spanish. The laughter stopped, briefly, startled into silence by her composure. That silence stayed with her longer than the laughter ever could. Later that night, she sat on the stone steps near the kitchen entrance, breathing in the scent of cooling embers and crushed oranges. She tilted her head toward the sky. The stars here were sharper than those by the river, more distant, less forgiving. And it was then, without announcement, without ceremony, that the current beneath her life shifted. Letters began to arrive. Men on horseback delivered them. The governor read them privately. Voices lowered. Doors closed. Julia was not told what the letters said. She did not need to be. She could feel the change in the way she was looked at, in the way conversations paused when she entered a room, in the careful politeness that now carried a different weight. Something was being arranged, something that would take her beyond these stone walls, beyond the language she had mastered, beyond the illusion of safety. The stone house had taught her how to read and write. It had also taught her a quieter lesson. That education could make a person visible, but visibility, in the wrong hands, could become another form of captivity, and somewhere beyond the governor's courtyard, another stage was already being prepared. Important decisions are rarely announced loudly. They are not shouted across rooms. They do not arrive with ceremony. They are made quietly, behind closed doors, in measured voices, over tables where ink dries faster than conscience. Julia never saw the moment her future changed. She only felt its aftershocks. It began with small shifts. The governor's schedule grew heavier. Visitors arrived more frequently, men whose coats were cut finer, whose words carried confidence sharpened by money and distance. Conversations stopped when Julia entered the room. Doors closed more often. Letters were folded and placed away quickly. No one spoke to her directly about what was happening. No one asked what she wanted. One afternoon, as sunlight bled through the shutters in thin, controlled lines, the governor sat across from a man whose name would not matter later. The man spoke with practiced ease. His accent carried the rhythm of trade and travel. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He spoke of opportunity, of cities beyond the horizon where people paid to see marvels, of audiences eager for the extraordinary, of a world that rewarded difference if presented correctly. He did not speak of cages. He did not speak of ownership. He spoke of contracts. Julia waited in another room, seated perfectly still. She traced letters on the page of a book she had already read twice. She could hear the murmur of voices through thick stone walls, soft enough that the words blurred, clear enough that she understood their purpose. She was being discussed, not as a child, not as a woman, but as a possibility. When the door finally opened, the governor did not look at her immediately. He adjusted his coat, straightened papers on his desk, and only then met her eyes. He spoke gently. He said she would travel. He said she would be seen. He said she would have a future beyond these walls. He did not say she could refuse. Julia listened without interruption. Her expression did not change. Years of observation had taught her that reaction often gave others more power than silence ever could. She asked only one question. "Will I return?" The governor hesitated. It was brief, barely visible, but Julia noticed. "I do not know," he said. That was the closest thing to honesty she would receive. The preparations began quickly. Clothes were packed, papers signed, instructions written. Julia's name appeared on documents not as a signature, but as an object of transfer. The language was polite, legal, clean. No word in those pages described what it felt like to be handed over. On the morning of departure, the courtyard was quiet, the sky pale, undecided. A cart waited near the gate. A man stood beside it, hat low, eyes sharp. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. Julia stepped out carrying a small bundle of belongings, a shawl, a book. Nothing from the river, nothing from the village, only what the stone house had allowed her to keep. She paused at the threshold. The governor stood watching. He did not step forward. He did not step back. His kindness, like everything else in that house, had limits. Julia inclined her head slightly, not in gratitude, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. The door closed behind her with a sound too final to be ignored. The road north stretched long and colorless. Days passed in a blur of dust and motion. Wheels groaned. Horses breathed heavily. Julia sat quietly, listening to voices that spoke of schedules and profits as if discussing weather. At night, when they stopped near roadside inns, she watched lantern light flicker against wooden walls. She heard laughter from rooms she was not invited into. She wrapped her shawl tightly and slept lightly, her mind alert even in rest. The further they traveled, the more unfamiliar the land became. Fields flattened, hills hardened, rivers grew fewer. The sounds of insects faded, replaced by the constant rhythm of wheels on stone. She learned new silences. At last, they reached the port. The air smelled different here, heavy with salt and iron. Gulls cried overhead. Ships loomed like moving cities, their masts slicing the sky into narrow fragments. Julia stood at the edge of the dock, staring at the water. She had never seen the sea before. It moved endlessly, restlessly, refusing to be contained. For a moment, she imagined the river of her childhood flowing into it somewhere beyond sight, carrying with it everything she had left behind. The ship was not elegant. It did not need to be. It carried cargo. It carried passengers. It carried futures that had been decided elsewhere. As she stepped aboard, the wood creaked beneath her feet. Ropes strained. Voices shouted orders in languages she did not yet know. The man accompanying her moved with purpose. Already at home in this world of exchange, Julia paused at the railing and looked back. The land was still there, solid, certain, soon. It would shrink into a line, then disappear entirely. She did not cry. She did not speak. The ship pulled away from the dock. Water churned. The port receded, and with it, the last place where Julia Pastrana had been known as anything other than a story waiting to be sold. Ahead lay the ocean, and beyond it, a world that would look at her closely, but never truly see her. New York did not welcome her. It overwhelmed her. The city rose from the harbor in layers of stone and smoke, louder and sharper than anything Julia had ever known. The air was thick with coal, salt, and movement. Wheels rattled across wet streets. Voices collided in languages she could not yet separate. Buildings climbed upward as if competing for space in the sky. Nothing here waited. She followed the man who had brought her across the ocean through narrow streets and crowded avenues. Her shawl was pulled tight around her shoulders, not against the cold, but against the eyes. She felt them before she saw them, glances that lingered, hesitated, returned. In this city, anonymity and exposure lived side by side. The place where she was taken was called Gothic Hall. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. A brick building pressed between others like it, its sign swinging slightly in the damp air. Inside, the space opened into something carefully constructed for attention. Rows of chairs faced a small wooden stage. Heavy curtains hung at the back, dark and absorbent, as if designed to swallow whatever stood before them. This was not a theater built for art. It was built for looking. Julia was shown the stage in silence. The boards beneath her feet were smooth from use. Lamps hung above, their glass already clouded from heat and smoke. When lit, they would cast a harsh, unforgiving glow, light that revealed without mercy. She understood. Then, what was expected of her? Not explanation, not conversation, not consent. Visibility. In the days before the performance, she was dressed and instructed. Clothing chosen not for comfort, but contrast. Fabric stiff and unfamiliar against her skin. A ribbon placed in her hair. She was told where to stand, how to turn, when to smile. They did not ask if she wanted to perform. They asked if she was ready. The handbills appeared overnight. They were pasted to walls. Lampposts, tavern doors. Ink still smelled faintly of oil. The illustrations bore only a passing resemblance to her. Features exaggerated, humanity blurred. The words were louder than the image. A marvel, a hybrid, a wonder of nature. And beneath it, her name, Julia Pastrana. On the evening of the first performance, the hall filled quickly. Coats brushed against one another. Chairs scraped. A low murmur rose and fell as people settled into anticipation. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of boredom, a few out of something darker they did not name. Julia stood behind the curtain. She listened. The sound of waiting has a texture. It presses inward. It tightens the chest. She felt it now, heavier than any silence she had known before. When the curtain lifted, the light struck her face like a physical force. For a brief moment, no one spoke. That pause, the instant when hundreds of eyes land at once, is unmistakable. It is not silence. It is assessment. She stepped forward. The boards creaked. Somewhere in the audience, someone inhaled sharply. Another whispered. A third laughed quietly. Unsure whether laughter was appropriate, Julia began to move. The dance had been chosen for her. Simple steps, lively rhythm, something foreign enough to feel exotic, familiar enough to be palatable. Her feet found the beat. Her body remembered motion. As she danced, she sang. Her voice cut through the room, clear, controlled, unmistakably human. For a moment, the music belonged to her, but the audience did not hear it that way. They watched her face, her hair, her jaw. Some leaned forward, others recoiled slightly, then leaned in again. Fascination sharpened by relief. The relief of believing oneself separate from what stood on stage. When the performance ended, applause followed, not thunderous, not unified, scattered, uneven, uncertain. Julia inclined her head, as she had been instructed, and stepped back into the shadow of the curtain. The light vanished. The noise softened behind the stage. The man who managed her smiled. It was the smile of calculation fulfilled. He spoke quickly, already planning the next night, the next crowd, the next city. Numbers passed between him and others in low voices. Julia stood apart, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of the performance settle into her body. That night, she lay awake in the small room provided for her. The applause replayed in her mind, but it was not the sound that lingered. It was the silence before it. The moment when the room had decided what she was. In the weeks that followed, the performances continued, night after night. Julia stepped beneath the lamps. Night after night, she danced and sang while the audience watched with a hunger that never quite filled. Posters multiplied. Her name spread through the city, carried by mouths that reshaped it with each retelling. She learned to move through backstage corridors without listening to the comments meant for her ears, but not her presence. She learned how to smile on cue, how to stand still when stillness was demanded. She learned how to disappear while being seen, and yet, beneath the spectacle, something remained intact. A voice that had learned language in a stone house, a body that remembered the rhythm of the river, a mind that understood. With growing clarity, what was being taken from her and what she would not give away. New York had given her a stage. It had also given her a lesson. That fame does not elevate, it consumes. And this was only the beginning. Fame arrived quietly, not as celebration, not as admiration. It arrived as repetition. The same posters on different walls, the same whispers spoken by new mouths, the same glances that lingered just long enough to stop being accidental. Julia Pastrana's name began to move faster than she did. It traveled through taverns and parlors, through newspapers folded under arms, through conversations that started with curiosity and ended with certainty. People spoke of her as though they had discovered something rather than witnessed someone. "I saw her last night," one man said. "She's not what I expected," another replied. "I heard she was raised in a cave," someone else added, lowering their voice as if sharing a secret. The details did not matter. The story mattered more. Handbills multiplied, each new print more exaggerated than the last. Her face became a caricature, lines sharpened, proportions distorted. Humanity was smoothed away to make room for spectacle. Words like woman disappeared, replaced by creature, hybrid, curiosity. Labels have weight. Once attached, they pull everything toward them. Julia felt it when she walked through the streets between performances. Children pointed openly now. Adults pretended not to stare and failed. Some crossed the street entirely. Others slowed their pace, matching hers for a few steps before drifting away. She had become visible in a way that erased privacy. And yet, inside the theater, something stranger happened. The more people stared, the less they seemed to see. They saw hair, not posture, jaw, not voice, difference, not discipline. They did not see the way she adjusted her breathing before stepping on stage, the precision in her movements, the control it took to sing clearly beneath heat and judgment. Backstage, Julia learned new routines. She learned where to stand so the light fell as expected. She learned which songs elicited curiosity rather than discomfort. She learned to time her bows to the audience's attention span. She learned to manage them, but managing attention does not mean owning it. After performances, crowds gathered outside the hall. Some waited just to catch another glimpse of her face. Others hoped to tell someone later that they had stood close to her, that they had seen the wonder with their own eyes. A few approached her directly. They asked questions framed as compliments. "Does it hurt? Were you born that way? Do you understand us?" Julia answered politely when required. She remained silent when not. She had learned that explanations rarely satisfied curiosity. They only fed it. Not all eyes were cruel. Among the audience were musicians who recognized rhythm, singers who heard pitch, people who noticed the discipline beneath the display. A handful wrote about her with something approaching respect, though even they could not resist framing her talent as secondary to her appearance. In those articles, praise was always conditional, remarkably skilled, despite surprisingly articulate. Given what? No one ever finished the sentence. The city grew colder as seasons changed. Fog settled into streets. Gas lamps blurred into halos. Julia moved through it all wrapped in wool and awareness, carrying the weight of being known without being understood. At night, in the quiet of her room, she replayed fragments of the day, the laughter that stopped too suddenly, the applause that never quite aligned, the silence when she met someone's gaze longer than expected. She thought often of the river, of water that did not judge shape, of movement without measurement. But the river was far away now, and New York had no patience for longing. The man who managed her watched the crowds carefully. He counted heads, tracked ticket sales, listened for buzz. He spoke of expansion, of other cities eager for novelty, of audiences who had not yet grown accustomed to her. "She won't last here forever," he said once, not unkindly. "They never do." Julia understood. Fame has an expiration date. When curiosity dulls, Something else must replace it, and soon. Another kind of attention arrived. Men began to attend performances who did not applaud. They sat quietly. They observed. They took notes. They spoke afterward not of dance or song, but of anatomy, of classification, of theories gaining traction in academic circles. They were doctors, scientists, men who believed knowledge justified intrusion. They approached Julia differently, not as a performer, but as evidence. Their questions were precise, their tone professional. They spoke of examinations, of understanding, of contributing to science. They did not ask if she wished to contribute. They assumed. Julia sensed the shift immediately. The crowd had been loud, unpredictable, exhausting, but it had been temporary. These men represented something colder, more permanent, a gaze that sought to define rather than consume. She stood at the threshold of something new, something that would claim authority over her body long after the applause faded. New York had given her a name. Now it was preparing to give her a classification. And once a human being becomes a category, it is very difficult to return. The room smelled of chemicals and lamp oil. It was not large, but it felt crowded, lined with shelves of glass jars. Instruments laid out with deliberate precision, papers stacked into neat, unforgiving piles. The light was harsh, brighter than the stage lamps, designed not to flatter but to reveal. Julia was asked to sit, not invited, not encouraged, asked. The men in the room wore dark coats and serious expressions. They spoke in English quickly, confidently, as though the words themselves carried authority simply by being spoken aloud. One of them stepped forward, introducing himself with a name that would later appear in journals and lectures. Stripped of context and consequence, they called this science. They asked her to remain still. Hands moved closer, not cruel, not gentle, clinical. Fingers lifted her chin, measured the width of her jaw, touched her arms, her face, the hair that covered her skin. Numbers were spoken aloud, written down, repeated. She was discussed as if she were not there. As you can see, note the structure. This suggests. Julia kept her hands folded in her lap, her breathing steady. She had learned this skill long before, how to withdraw without leaving, how to remain present without participating. Stillness became her armor. They did not ask about her education. They did not ask about her languages. They did not ask about her music. They asked about classification. One man cleared his throat and spoke with certainty. He used words that sounded final, scientific, unchallengeable, hybrid, intermediate, specimen. He drew lines between categories as if human worth could be plotted on a chart. Another nodded in agreement. Pens scratched across paper. In their eyes, Julia's body was no longer hers. It was evidence, something to be cited, debated, claimed. They spoke of evolutionary chains and missing links, of proving theories that had existed long before she entered the room. She was useful to them. That usefulness replaced curiosity with ownership. When she met one man's gaze directly, his hand hesitated. Just for a moment, the smallest fracture in his certainty. He looked away quickly, returning to his notes. They did not like being seen by what they studied. The examination ended without ceremony. She was thanked. Not for her patience, not for her humanity, but for her contribution. The word followed her out into the cold street, where the night air felt sharp and alive against her skin. Outside, the city breathed. Horses passed. Carriages rattled. Voices rose and fell. Julia pulled her shawl tighter around herself and tilted her head toward the sky. The stars were faint here, nearly erased by smoke and light, but she searched for them anyway. That night, articles began to take shape. Not in newspapers, but in journals, in lecture notes, in letters exchanged between men who would never ask her name aloud. They wrote with confidence, turning observation into declaration. She was no longer a performer. She was a conclusion. The language spread quickly. Academic curiosity traveled faster than applause ever had. Soon, more men arrived with more questions and more instruments. Each room looked slightly different. Each examination felt the same. Measure, record, define. Julia wondered what they wrote after she left. Did they mention the clarity of her voice, the precision of her movements, the way she spoke calmly, carefully, even under their scrutiny? She knew the answer. They wrote numbers, angles, labels that allowed them to speak about her without acknowledging her presence. One night, after another examination, she noticed a handbill near her feet on the street. It had been torn, stepped on, scribbled over. Her image stared back at her. Distorted, exaggerated. Someone had scrawled a single word across it in thick ink. Beast. The paper fluttered briefly in the wind before being crushed beneath a passing wheel. Julia watched it disappear. Back in her room. She sat alone in silence. The city pressed in from all sides, sound seeping through walls, light leaking beneath the door. She ran her fingers over the edge of a book, grounding herself in something solid, something that had once belonged only to her. Science had claimed her body. The crowd had claimed her image. What remained was quieter, harder to reach, and that frightened them, because despite their certainty, despite their measurements and declarations, there were moments, brief, undeniable moments, when their theories faltered. When a student hesitated before writing, when a doctor's voice wavered slightly mid-sentence. Those moments did not change the outcome, but they mattered. They proved something the men in white coats could not erase. That Julia Pastrana was not an idea, not a specimen, not a bridge between categories. She was a woman standing in rooms that refused to see her, and the world, unsatisfied with merely defining her, was already preparing to carry her further, across borders, across oceans, toward a place where spectacle and science would intertwine even more tightly. The applause was fading. The gaze was sharpening, and the journey was far from over. The ocean did not care who she was. That was its first mercy. When Julia Pastrana boarded the ship bound for Europe, no one on deck stared the way audiences did. Sailors moved with practiced indifference. Ropes were pulled, cargo was secured, orders were shouted and answered. The ship existed to cross water, not to judge what stood upon it. For the first time in years, Julia felt partially unseen. The man who now traveled with her was Theodore Lent. He was different from the others. Where merchants spoke of opportunity and scientists spoke of proof, Lent spoke of control, though never using the word itself. He was precise, confident, endlessly attentive to details that turned people into assets. He watched crowds the way others watched weather. He understood desire and knew how to package it. He had watched Julia perform. He had read what the scientists wrote, and he had decided she belonged to him. The contract that bound them was written in language too small for conscience. It described appearances, travel, obligations. It did not describe fatigue, or fear, or what it meant to wake each morning knowing your body had already been promised elsewhere. Julia listened when Lent spoke. She learned quickly that he preferred obedience framed as agreement. He explained Europe as if it were inevitable: grand theaters, learned men, audiences who prided themselves on sophistication. He promised respect without defining it. She did not argue. She had learned that resistance, when offered too early, only sharpened the blade. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction. Days passed marked only by light and movement. At night, the stars appeared sharper than those above New York, cold, distant, indifferent. Julia spent hours on deck wrapped in her shawl, letting the wind cut through the layers of performance that clung to her. She sang softly to herself. Not the songs chosen for audiences, not the melodies arranged for applause. Old songs, broken songs, songs that did not need witnesses. The sailors listened from a distance. Some paused briefly. None commented. Out here, far from land, difference lost its urgency. The ocean flattened hierarchy. Storms treated everyone the same. One night, the ship pitched violently under heavy wind. Rain lashed the deck. Ropes strained. Voices shouted into darkness. Julia gripped the railing, soaked and unsteady, feeling the ship rise and fall beneath her. In that chaos, something loosened inside her. The storm did not ask her to explain herself. It did not measure. It did not name. It simply existed. When the sea finally calmed, the air felt newly washed. Lent complained of delays and discomfort. Julia stood at the bow, letting salt dry on her skin, feeling, if only briefly, unclaimed. Weeks later, Europe emerged from the fog. London arrived as a mass of stone and smoke. Heavier and older than New York, the air smelled of coal and damp brick. The streets moved differently, quieter in their curiosity, but no less hungry. Here, fascination wore the mask of refinement. Lent was energized. He spoke of theaters already secured, of scientific societies eager to examine her, of audiences who believed themselves enlightened. He spoke of headlines, of lectures, of salons where her presence would provoke discussion rather than laughter. Julia followed him through narrow streets slick with moisture. She listened to hooves on stone, to distant bells, to languages layered over one another. She had crossed an ocean, but the gaze awaited her here as faithfully as ever. The London theater was larger than Gothic Hall. Heavier curtains, brighter gaslight, seats arranged to ensure no angle went unseen. This stage did not pretend to be entertainment alone. It claimed education, culture, advancement. Before her debut, she was led into a dressing room with a large oval mirror framed in gold. A woman adjusted her hair, smoothed her dress, corrected her posture. Julia stared at her reflection. It was her face, and it was not. Years of stories had settled into it: villages, stages, examinations, crossings. She searched for the girl by the river and found only traces. That evening, when the curtain rose, the silence was deeper than anything she had known before. The audience leaned forward not with laughter, but with scrutiny. They watched as if they expected to learn something by looking hard enough. Julia danced. She sang. Her voice filled the space, clear and unwavering. Applause followed, stronger, more unified, but colder. Approval without warmth. Lent watched from the wings, calculating, after the performance. She was not allowed to rest. She was taken to rooms where men waited with notebooks and credentials. They spoke of her as a marvel of nature, of significance to science, of value to knowledge. They debated her openly while she stood among them, silent. One man spoke up, quietly, carefully. She is, he said, entirely human. The room shifted. Discomfort rippled through certainty. The statement was noted and dismissed. Consensus returned quickly. Science preferred agreement over truth. Julia felt something tighten in her chest. Not hope, recognition. That even here, even now, her humanity was negotiable. By the end of the night, Lent spoke of schedules, of tours, of Paris, of Berlin, of expanding reach. He spoke as though momentum itself were virtue. Julia returned to her room alone. She sat by the window, watching fog gather around the lamps below. The city breathed heavily, ancient and restless. She pressed her forehead against the glass, cool and solid. Across an ocean, a river still moved quietly through Sinaloa. Here, the water was stone and smoke, and Julia understood with painful clarity. The world would never stop looking at her, but it would always decide what it saw. The marriage was presented as a kindness. That was how Theodore Lent explained it to others. A gesture of protection, a sign of legitimacy, proof that Julia Pastrana was not merely an exhibit, but a woman worthy of respect. The explanation sounded reasonable when spoken aloud. It always does, to the public. The marriage softened the spectacle. Posters changed tone. Articles referred to her as Mrs. Lent. The implication was clear. She was no longer alone, no longer vulnerable, no longer owned by crowds. But ownership does not disappear when it changes names. It only becomes quieter. The ceremony itself was small, practical, unremarkable. There were no flowers worth remembering, no music meant to last, just signatures, witnesses, and the quiet finality of ink drying on paper. Julia wore a simple dress. She stood still. She said the words expected of her. Theodore Lent smiled. To him, the marriage was efficient. It bound her to him legally, socially, financially. It silenced certain critics while empowering others. It allowed him to speak for her with authority he had not previously possessed. He was now husband, manager, and gatekeeper. The roles blended seamlessly. Afterward, nothing slowed, if anything. The pace increased. They traveled constantly, London to Paris, Paris to Berlin, Berlin to Vienna. Each city welcomed her with its own version of fascination. Each claimed to see something unique in her. Each insisted on examination, explanation, categorization. Julia learned the architecture of European theaters, the weight of velvet curtains, the smell of gaslight mixed with perfume and damp stone. She learned how applause differed by country, some louder, some restrained, some polite to the point of cruelty. She learned how to smile in 5 languages. At night, she slept lightly. Travel leaves little room for rest. Neither does being watched. Lent monitored everything: her schedule, her performances, her interactions. When she was ill, he adjusted the program rather than canceling it. When she was exhausted, he reminded her of commitments already made. His concern, when expressed, always carried calculation beneath it. "You are stronger than you think," he told her once. It was not encouragement, it was instruction. The scientific interest followed them everywhere. Doctors requested private examinations. Professors invited them to lectures where Julia was discussed before she ever entered the room. Her body became a traveling argument, a living footnote in debates about evolution and classification. She stood silently while men argued her existence. Occasionally, someone spoke differently, a scholar who hesitated before drawing conclusions, a physician who acknowledged her intelligence before her anatomy. Those moments were rare. They did not alter the narrative. Pregnancy arrived quietly. Julia noticed the changes before anyone else did. Fatigue that settled deeper than usual. Nausea that lingered. A heaviness in her body she had never felt before. When she told Lent, his reaction was measured, concern mixed with calculation. A child could complicate schedules. It could also enhance fascination. Europe was not gentle to pregnant women who were already spectacles. Performances continued longer than they should have. Julia danced and sang beneath lights that made her dizzy. She learned how to breathe through discomfort, how to steady herself when the room tilted slightly. The child was born prematurely, a small body, covered in fine dark hair, so like her. It lived briefly, too briefly. Julia held her child as it faded, memorizing the weight, the warmth, the undeniable reality of it. For a moment, the world receded. There were no audiences, no scientists, no labels, just a mother and a child. Then the moment passed. The death was recorded clinically. Notes were taken, observations made. The child's body became another point of interest, another confirmation for theories already formed. Grief had no place on the schedule. Julia returned to the stage, weakened, changed. Her voice remained steady, but something behind it had quieted. Audiences noticed. Some whispered of tragedy. Others leaned in closer, eager to witness sorrow layered onto spectacle. Lent adjusted the narrative. He spoke of resilience, of devotion, of duty. Julia did not contradict him. Her body began to fail. Illness settled into her lungs. Fatigue deepened into something dangerous. Travel became harder. The lights harsher. Each performance required more effort than the last. In Moscow, winter pressed heavily against stone walls. Julia struggled to breathe. Her cough worsened. Fever followed. Lent delayed cancellation until the last possible moment. She died far from home. Not in Mexico, not near the river, in a foreign city. Surrounded by language she could speak but no longer cared to use. She was 36 years old. Her death did not end the spectacle. Within hours, discussions began, not of burial, not of rest, but of preservation. Doctors requested her body. Lent agreed. Arrangements were made quickly, efficiently. Her remains were embalmed, prepared. She was displayed once more, not as a performer, not as a wife, but as a specimen that no longer resisted. The final cost of her marriage was not paid in life. It was paid in what came after. Because even in death, Julia Pastrana was not allowed to belong to herself. Death did not free her. It should have. For most people, death marks an end, the final boundary beyond which the world can no longer demand anything. But for Julia Pastrana, death was not a release. It was a transition. Within hours of her final breath, her body became an object of discussion. Doctors spoke in hushed but excited tones. Papers were consulted, measurements considered, questions raised, not about where she should rest, but about what could still be learned from her. Theodore Lent did not hesitate. He had made a career out of decisions like this. Arrangements were made swiftly, efficiently. Julia's body was embalmed using the most advanced techniques of the time. Chemicals replaced warmth, flesh stiffened. The softness that had once carried breath and song was preserved into permanence. She was prepared not for burial, but for continuation. Her child's body, small, fragile, barely given time to exist, was treated the same way. Mother and son, preserved together, transformed into exhibits before the ground could ever claim them. Lent displayed them publicly. People came. They always did. Crowds gathered not to mourn, but to observe, to stare at what death had not erased. to satisfy curiosity that no longer needed politeness. There was no pretense of art now, no music, no performance, only glass cases, only labels, only bodies arranged to answer questions no one had the courage to ask aloud. Julia's face, frozen in stillness, bore no expression. Whatever pain or exhaustion had accompanied her final days was sealed away beneath chemicals and technique, in death. She appeared calm, almost peaceful. The illusion unsettled people. Some recoiled, others leaned closer. Doctors debated preservation methods. Scholars pointed out features they believed confirmed long-held theories. Visitors whispered words like unnatural, extraordinary, proof. No one used her name. She had become a reference, a specimen that traveled where she no longer could. Years passed. Theodore Lent continued to exhibit her remains across Europe, in halls and lecture rooms, in fairs and private demonstrations. Julia Pastrana was presented as the ultimate confirmation of ideas that refused to die. When Lent himself descended into instability, his mind unraveling under obsession and failure, Julia's body remained intact. It outlasted him. Ownership passed hands. Institutions claimed her. Collectors traded her. Museums debated her value. Each transfer came with paperwork, catalog numbers, descriptions stripped of any trace of her life. The language grew colder with time, more distant, more confident in its authority. Decades turned into a century. Science evolved. Ideas once spoken with certainty were quietly abandoned. The theories that had relied on Julia's body as evidence were dismantled, replaced by understanding that acknowledged their cruelty and ignorance. But bodies preserved in glass do not disappear when ideas change. They remain. Julia Pastrana remained, hidden in storage rooms, displayed briefly, then removed, forgotten, then rediscovered. Her existence embarrassed institutions that no longer wished to explain how they had once treated her. Some covered her. Others locked her away. A few argued she should still be studied, still be shown, even in absence. She was contested. Her body traveled through time the way it had once traveled through space, moved without consent, discussed without voice in the late 20th century. Voices finally began to shift, not scientists, not collectors, but activists, historians, people who asked a question that had been ignored for over 100 years. Why was she still here? Why had death not been enough? Slowly, painfully, conversations began about dignity, about consent, about the difference between knowledge and exploitation. Julia Pastrana's name resurfaced, not as a curiosity, but as a warning. She had been denied rest for over a century. In 2013, the decision was finally made. Her remains would be returned to Mexico. The process was careful, bureaucratic, heavy with the weight of past mistakes. Officials spoke of respect, of closure, of responsibility. But no apology could travel back through time. The coffin that arrived in Sinaloa was not elaborate. It did not need to be. It carried something far heavier than bones. It carried a history of looking without seeing. As the plane touched down, no crowds gathered, no headlines celebrated the moment, only a quiet acknowledgement that something long overdue was finally happening. Julia Pastrana was coming home, not as an exhibit, not as evidence, but as a human being. The earth that had waited nearly 200 years would finally receive her, and in doing so, it would close a chapter the world had kept open far too long. The journey home did not begin with celebration. It began with paperwork. Forms were signed, permissions granted, committees convened. Each document carried language carefully chosen to avoid responsibility while acknowledging necessity. Words like repatriation, ethical review, Historical context replaced older, colder terms. Julia Pastrana's body had become a problem that needed resolving, not because of who she was, but because of what her continued captivity said about those who kept her. For decades, she had been stored rather than buried, wrapped rather than mourned, protected not out of care, but out of discomfort. Institutions that once displayed her now debated quietly how to remove her without drawing attention to their past. In the end, it was decided that silence was the most respectful option. No public exhibition, no press spectacle, no final display, just a return. The coffin was sealed carefully, layers between her remains and the outside world. Labels were removed, catalog numbers erased, for the first time since her death. Julia Pastrana was no longer classified. She was unnamed cargo, and yet, for the first time, she was also free from observation. The flight to Mexico was uneventful. The aircraft moved steadily through air that had carried her across oceans before, this time without audience or expectation. No one aboard knew who she was. No one asked. That anonymity mattered. When the plane landed, there were no cameras waiting, no crowd, just officials, a few representatives, and a quiet understanding that something deeply overdue had arrived. Her coffin was transferred gently, deliberately, each movement careful, restrained, as if the hands handling her now were aware of the centuries they could not undo. The road back to Sinaloa was long, fields passed, towns blurred. The land shifted from modern sprawl to something older, closer to what it had been when Julia first left. With every mile, the distance between spectacle and silence grew. The village did not look the same. It could not. Generations had come and gone, houses rebuilt, roads paved, electricity strung where candles once flickered. But the shape of the land remained familiar. The river still bent where it always had. The wind still moved through mesquite trees with the same patient indifference. When word spread that she had returned, people came quietly, not out of curiosity, not to stare, but to witness. Many did not know her story fully. Some knew fragments. Others knew only that a woman who had been wronged by the world was finally being allowed to rest. The burial was simple. There were no speeches about science, no retelling of myths, no recitation of the cruelty she had endured. The focus was not on what had been done to her, but on what was finally being done for her. Dignity does not require explanation. As the coffin was lowered, the sound of earth meeting wood echoed softly, not harsh, not violent, just final. Somewhere nearby, a bird took flight. A child whispered a question to an adult who did not answer. An old woman crossed herself. Time folded inward. For a moment, Julia Pastrana was not a historical figure, not a symbol, not a cautionary tale. She was simply a person being returned to the ground that had first held her. The priest spoke briefly. About rest, about home, about the quiet mercy of earth that asks nothing in return. No one clapped, no one recorded. The moment did not belong to history. It belonged to silence. When the ceremony ended, people lingered, not because they were unsure what to do next, but because leaving felt abrupt, as if walking away too quickly might reopen something that had only just been allowed to close. Eventually, they did leave. Life resumed, but something had shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough. The world could not change what it had done to Julia Pastrana, but it could decide what it would no longer do. Her return did not erase the past. It framed it. It forced a question that lingered long after the grave was filled. How many others were never given this chance? As night settled over Sinaloa, the wind moved gently through the cemetery. Crickets began their steady song. The river continued its quiet work, carrying water and memory through the land. Julia Pastrana lay beneath the soil, unseen, unmeasured, unnamed by anyone but herself, for the first time since her death. She was not being looked at. She was being allowed to rest. When the earth settles, silence follows. Not the empty silence of forgetting, but the heavier kind. The kind that asks something of those who remain. Julia Pastrana's grave does not draw crowds. There are no signs pointing the way. No glass cases. No explanatory plaques detailing measurements or theories. If you stand there today, you would see only soil, sky, and the slow movement of wind through grass. Nothing about the place demands attention. That, perhaps, is the point. For nearly 2 centuries, Julia Pastrana was never allowed this kind of quiet. Her life was examined, her body debated, her death postponed by preservation and display. Even when science moved on, when theories collapsed under the weight of their own cruelty, she remained suspended in the aftermath, a reminder not of knowledge, but of power. What remains now is not her body. What remains is a question. Who gets to decide what is worth looking at, and at what cost? In the 19th century, the world called itself enlightened while measuring skulls and categorizing flesh. It believed progress justified intrusion, that curiosity excused cruelty, that naming something made it understood. Julia Pastrana lived inside that contradiction. She was intelligent in an age that refused to acknowledge intelligence where it was inconvenient. She was talented in a world that demanded novelty over humanity. She was a woman whose voice carried across stages, yet was rarely heard where it mattered. Her story is often told as an anomaly, a strange case, a singular tragedy. But it is not singular. It belongs to a pattern that repeats whenever power looks at difference and decides it must be owned, explained, or consumed. When bodies become symbols, when people become proofs. The language has changed since Julia's time. The gaze has not. Today, we no longer hang posters calling people curiosities. We use different words, softer words, words that claim concern or interest or representation. But the impulse, to reduce a human life to what makes it unusual, remains uncomfortably familiar. Julia Pastrana forces us to sit with that discomfort, not because her appearance was unusual, but because the response to it was so ordinary. No villain in her story believed himself cruel. No institution thought itself unethical at the time. Everyone was simply doing what their era allowed. That is what makes it dangerous. When Julia was finally buried, the act was framed as closure, as justice delayed but delivered. And in some ways, it was. A woman denied rest was finally allowed it. But closure is not the same as resolution. Resolution would require something harder. It would require acknowledging that progress without empathy is just efficiency wearing a moral costume. That science without consent becomes extraction. That curiosity unchecked by humility turns into entitlement. Julia Pastrana did not ask to be remembered. She did not leave behind a manifesto. She did not argue her case in print. What she left behind were traces, a voice described by those who heard it, a discipline witnessed by those who watched closely, a dignity that survived environments designed to strip it away. And that may be her most unsettling legacy, that despite everything, contracts, exhibitions, examinations, classifications, the world never fully succeeded in turning her into what it wanted her to be. Not entirely. There were moments when she disrupted the narrative simply by existing as herself. When a scientist hesitated, when a crowd quieted, when someone, briefly, saw past the label and into the person standing beneath it. Those moments did not change history, but they matter, because they remind us that the line between observation and violation is not fixed by time. It is drawn, again and again, by individual choices. Julia Pastrana's grave does not ask for pity. It asks for responsibility. Responsibility to question how we look. Responsibility to notice who is being spoken about instead of spoken with. Responsibility to remember that dignity is not granted by institutions, it is inherent. The river near Santiago de Ocoroni still flows. It carries no record of what passed along its banks nearly 200 years ago. It does not remember exhibitions or debates. It does not preserve bodies or reputations. It moves forward, uninterested in spectacle, unmoved by classification. Julia Pastrana has returned to the earth beside it. What remains is not her story alone. What remains is the mirror it holds up to us, and the question it leaves behind. Unanswered and unavoidable. When the world looks at difference today, has it really learned how to see? History has a way of pretending it has learned. It buries its mistakes, renames its methods, moves on. Julia Pastrana was laid to rest. But the gaze that followed her did not stay behind in the 19th century. It adapted. It softened its language. It learned how to sound ethical while asking the same old questions. Today, no one would dare call her what they once did. No one would hang posters using those words. But the impulse, the need to look, to categorize, to consume difference, remains intact. It lives in screens now. It lives in headlines that promise the most unusual, the rarest, the unbelievable. It lives in documentaries that claim compassion while framing suffering as content. It lives in comment sections where empathy competes with entertainment and often loses. The world says it has changed, and in many ways, it has, but not where it matters most. Modern science no longer debates whether someone like Julia is human. That question has been settled, officially, academically, comfortably, instead. It asks different ones. How rare is this condition? How does it affect daily life? Can we show it, tastefully? The questions are cleaner now. So are the studios. Consent is discussed. Forms are signed. Language is careful. But care does not always mean restraint. Sometimes it simply means efficiency without guilt. Julia Pastrana did not live to see a world where her condition had a medical name. She never heard words like genetic mutation or hypertrichosis spoken with clinical neutrality. She lived in a time when ignorance was loud. We live in a time where ignorance whispers, and whispers travel farther. If Julia were born today, she would not be taken from her village and sold across borders, not like before. She would be invited, featured, interviewed. Her story would be framed as empowerment. She would be told she could control the narrative. That is the modern promise. But control is fragile when attention is profitable. The camera does not ask why it wants to look. It only asks how long it can keep someone watching. Algorithms do not understand dignity. They understand engagement. Difference still sells. It always has. Julia's story unsettles us not because it is distant, but because it is familiar. Because the structures that consumed her did not collapse with time. They refined themselves. They learned how to say representation instead of display, awareness instead of exhibition, storytelling instead of spectacle. The result often looks the same. A life reduced to its most visible feature. A person flattened into a symbol. Complexity trimmed away for clarity. We tell ourselves that intention matters, and it does. But impact matters more. Julia Pastrana never consented to be a lesson, and yet she became one. Not because she was different, but because the world could not tolerate difference without explanation. That intolerance did not end with her burial. It simply moved forward in time. What history asks of us now is not guilt. It asks for vigilance, to notice when curiosity crosses into entitlement, to question who benefits from being seen, to recognize when empathy becomes another form of consumption. Julia Pastrana does not need to be rescued from the past. She needs to be protected from repetition. Her story is not a closed chapter. It is a reference point, a quiet warning embedded in the progress we celebrate, because the most dangerous belief history ever produces is this: that we are too advanced to repeat it, and that belief, more than ignorance, is what keeps the gaze alive. Consent is supposed to change everything. That is what we tell ourselves now. We believe that if someone agrees, if they sign a form, if they say yes on camera, if they smile while telling their story, then the exchange becomes fair, ethical, clean. But consent does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside pressure, inside imbalance, inside systems that reward visibility and punish obscurity. Julia Pastrana never gave consent in the modern sense. No one asked her. No one believed it necessary. Her body was taken, displayed, examined because the world assumed the right to do so. We tell ourselves we are different now because we ask first. But asking is not the same as offering a real choice. Imagine being told that your difference is valuable, but only if you let others see it, that your story matters, but only if it fits a format, that your voice will be heard, but only through a lens someone else controls. That is not freedom. That is negotiation under constraint. Today, people whose bodies fall outside the narrow definitions of normal are often invited to speak, not as individuals, but as representatives. They are asked to explain themselves, educate others, and perform vulnerability in exchange for visibility. The language is polite, the tone supportive, the demand is the same. Be seen, so others can feel informed. Julia Pastrana was never asked to educate anyone, and yet, her life was turned into a lesson without her permission. Her suffering became proof. Her body became argument. The difference now is that we call it awareness. We say representation matters, and it does. But representation without agency is just repetition with better lighting. When someone consents today, we rarely ask what refusal would cost them. Would they lose income, opportunity, relevance? Would they disappear? Consent given under fear of erasure is not a full choice. It is survival framed as agreement. Julia Pastrana survived by adapting, by learning language, by controlling what little she could control, by standing still when movement would have been punished. She did not consent, but she endured, and endurance is often mistaken for acceptance. The modern world admires resilience. It celebrates those who own their difference. But admiration can be another form of pressure. It demands performance. It rewards those who transform pain into something consumable. Julia did not have the option to rebrand herself. But if she did, if she were alive now, would the choice be as free as we imagine? Would she be asked to speak about her condition before being asked who she is? Would interviews focus on her voice or her appearance? Would silence be respected or interpreted as ingratitude? Consent sounds simple. In practice, it is fragile. It bends easily toward power. The question is not whether someone says yes. The question is, what happens if they say no? Julia Pastrana's story reminds us that ethics are not defined by intention alone. They are defined by structure, by who holds control over resources, platforms, and narratives. Science once justified its gaze with progress. Entertainment justified it with curiosity. Today, we justify it with choice. The shape changes. The imbalance remains. True consent requires something uncomfortable. It requires accepting that some stories are not ours to tell, that some lives do not exist for our understanding, that not every difference is an invitation. Julia Pastrana never had that protection. The least we can do now is recognize how easily the illusion of consent allows the same patterns to continue. Cleaner, quieter, harder to challenge, because exploitation does not always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it arrives smiling, with paperwork, with good intentions, and history has already shown us where that road leads. Every story has two positions, the one being seen and the one doing the seeing. History tends to focus on the first. It examines the body, the difference, the anomaly. It documents the life that was exposed, but it rarely turns the lens around. It rarely asks who was allowed to look and why. Julia Pastrana was looked at by many kinds of people: crowds who paid for tickets, scientists who claimed authority, managers who saw profit, institutions that framed curiosity as purpose. Each believed their gaze was justified. None believed it needed permission. The power was never in Julia's body. It was in the eyes that claimed the right to interpret it. Looking is not neutral. It never has been. To look is to frame, to select, to decide what matters and what does not. When the world looked at Julia Pastrana, it did not simply observe her appearance. It constructed meaning around it. Meaning that justified action. Meaning that transformed curiosity into entitlement. She did not become a spectacle because she was different. She became a spectacle because others had the power to turn difference into currency. The crowd did not invent the system, but it sustained it. Every ticket purchased confirmed demand. Every article read validated relevance. Every lecture attended reinforced authority. Responsibility dissolved into participation. No single person felt accountable, because everyone was involved. This is how exploitation survives. Not through monsters, but through consensus. The 19th century was honest about its hunger. It wanted to see, to classify, to dominate nature through knowledge. Its cruelty was visible because it was loud. Our era is quieter. We sit at a distance now, behind screens, behind commentary, behind the illusion of separation. We believe that watching is passive. It is not. Every view signals value. Every share amplifies framing. Every silence allows repetition. The gaze still decides who is worthy of attention and on what terms. Julia Pastrana did not choose her audience. Today, we believe audiences are chosen, but platforms complicate that belief. Algorithms do not ask who should be seen. They ask what will be watched. They flatten context. They reward extremes. They favor stories that provoke reaction over reflection. Difference becomes content again, packaged differently, consumed faster, forgotten just as quickly. The viewer remains powerful. The viewer always has been. The difference is that now, the viewer rarely feels implicated. Distance creates comfort. Comfort dulls accountability. Julia's audience stood feet away from her. They heard her voice echo through halls. They watched her breathe, sweat, tire. They could not pretend distance. We can, and that makes restraint harder, not easier. The question Julia Pastrana leaves us is not whether the past was cruel. We already know that. The question is whether we recognize cruelty when it wears modern clothing. When it calls itself interest. When it calls itself awareness. When it calls itself storytelling. Who gets to look? And who decides when looking becomes taking? The answer is not found in policy alone, or in intention, or even in consent forms. It is found in attention, in what we choose to watch, in how long we linger, in whether we demand complexity or accept spectacle. Julia Pastrana was denied the power to look back on equal terms. Her gaze was never centered. Her interpretation of herself never prioritized. That imbalance is the core of her story. Not her appearance, not her condition, but the asymmetry of power between observer and observed. If history teaches anything, it is this: the most dangerous gaze is the one that believes itself harmless, the one that claims curiosity without responsibility, the one that consumes without reflection. Julia Pastrana does not accuse us. She does something more unsettling. She asks whether we are willing to question the comfort of looking, because the moment we refuse to examine that power, the moment we assume our gaze is innocent, we step into the same position history once occupied, and history, as Julia's life reminds us, is always watching to see if we will repeat it. A body is never just a body. It is a story waiting to be told or taken. Long before Julia Pastrana spoke for herself, her body was already speaking on her behalf, or rather, others were speaking through it. Her skin, her hair, her jaw became language. Her existence became narrative material shaped by people who never asked what story she would choose to tell. This is how bodies are turned into texts. They are read selectively, interpreted aggressively, edited without consent. Julia's body was described in pamphlets, journals, lectures, and whispers. Each retelling stripped something away. Complexity was inconvenient, contradiction unwelcome. What remained was a simplified version, easier to explain, easier to sell, a story that could fit on a poster. Once a body becomes a story told by others, it stops belonging to the person inside it. Julia learned this early. She learned it when applause followed her movements but never her words, when doctors debated her anatomy but ignored her intelligence, when audiences remembered her appearance but forgot her voice. The body spoke louder than the person, because others made it so. This pattern did not end with her. History is filled with bodies that were never allowed to be ordinary. Bodies marked by difference, of race, disability, gender, size, have been endlessly narrativized. Their value determined not by who they are, but by what they represent to someone else. The body becomes metaphor, evidence, warning, inspiration, anything but itself. Julia Pastrana was framed as proof of theories that no longer exist. When those theories collapsed, the story did not disappear. It simply changed genre, from scientific curiosity to historical tragedy, from spectacle to cautionary tale. Still a story, still told from the outside, even now. When we speak her name with respect, we must ask whose narrative we are repeating. Are we telling her story or using her story? The difference is subtle, but it matters. To tell someone's story is to center their perspective. To use it is to extract meaning for our own purposes. Julia left behind very few words of her own, not because she had nothing to say, but because no one thought to preserve them. Her letters, her reflections, her private thoughts were never considered valuable. What survived were descriptions, measurements, opinions, judgments. Her inner life was treated as irrelevant. And so, later generations filled in the silence. They imagined her pain. They imagined her strength. They imagined her thoughts. Imagination can be an act of empathy. It can also be another form of control. When we imagine someone too completely, we risk replacing them with a version that feels comfortable to us, a version that confirms our values, a version that fits neatly into lessons we want to teach. Julia Pastrana resists that neatness. Her life does not resolve cleanly. Her endurance does not redeem the cruelty inflicted upon her. Her suffering does not grant meaning to the harm. She was not a symbol waiting to be interpreted. She was a person navigating limited choices with intelligence and restraint. That distinction matters, especially now, today. Bodies are still turned into stories at astonishing speed. A photograph circulates, a clip goes viral, a diagnosis becomes a headline, context collapses. Identity is flattened into a single frame. The body becomes content. We believe we are more careful now because we add disclaimers, because we use respectful language, because we frame narratives around empowerment. But empowerment, when imposed, can be just another script. Julia Pastrana did not get to decide how her body would be framed. We cannot undo that. What we can do is notice when we repeat the pattern, when we talk about bodies more than we listen to people, when we prioritize visibility over agency, when we confuse storytelling with ownership. The body is not a story waiting to be told by the loudest voice. It is a life experienced from the inside. Julia Pastrana lived that life largely unseen, despite being constantly looked at. Her body carried narratives imposed upon it, but her interiority remained guarded, private, intact. That may be the quietest form of resistance history records, not defiance, not protest, but the refusal to become exactly what others demand. As long as we remember Julia only as a story, we risk repeating the same mistake the past made. To honor her is not to narrate her endlessly. It is to recognize the limits of narration itself. Julia Pastrana had a voice. This is often forgotten. Not a metaphorical one, a literal voice. Trained, controlled, capable of carrying melody across rooms designed to swallow sound. People who heard her sing remarked on its clarity, its discipline, its calm authority. And yet, her voice was rarely treated as something that belonged to her. It was allowed, never centered. Julia spoke several languages. She answered questions carefully. She navigated interviews and examinations with precision. But her words were never considered primary evidence of who she was. Her body spoke louder to others than her speech ever could. This is how voice loses ownership, not through silence, but through displacement. When someone speaks and is still spoken over. When words are heard but not trusted. When testimony is treated as decoration rather than authority. Julia's statements were filtered through others, quoted selectively, paraphrased into irrelevance. Her voice became background noise to louder narratives crafted by men with titles and platforms. They spoke about her constantly, rarely with her. This imbalance is not accidental. Authority decides which voices count as truth and which count as texture. Julia's words were considered subjective, emotional, unreliable. Her measurements were considered objective. Numbers carried weight. Her voice carried tone. So history recorded data and discarded speech. Even today, when historians attempt to recover her story, they rely on fragments written by others, letters that mention her, articles that describe her, lectures that interpret her existence. Her own voice survives only in echoes. This absence creates a temptation to fill the silence. We imagine what she must have felt, what she might have said if given space, what she would tell us now if she could speak freely, sometimes. This impulse comes from care, but care does not grant ownership. Speaking for someone, especially someone whose voice was systematically minimized, risks repeating the same harm under gentler language. Julia Pastrana's silence in the archive is not an invitation. It is a warning. It reminds us that voice is not just the ability to speak. It is the power to be believed, to be cited, to be treated as a source rather than a subject. That power was denied to her. And denial of voice does not always require censorship. Sometimes it requires attention diverted elsewhere. The crowd listened to her sing, but listened harder to their own reactions. Scientists listened to her answers, but trusted their theories more. Managers listened to her needs, but prioritized schedules. Her voice existed inside systems that had already decided what mattered. That is why ownership is the key issue. Who owns a voice once it enters public space? Who controls how it is framed, edited, amplified, or ignored? Today, we celebrate platforms that give voice to the marginalized. But giving is not the same as yielding control. Often, voices are welcomed only when they conform to expected narratives. Say the right things, in the right tone, at the right time. Julia Pastrana did not perform grievance the way modern audiences expect. She did not dramatize her suffering. She did not demand recognition. She adapted. That adaptation is often misread as acceptance. It was not. It was strategy, a way of preserving interior autonomy when exterior control was unavoidable. Julia's voice did not vanish. It was contained within music chosen for her, contained within answers shaped to survive scrutiny, contained within silence when speech would have cost too much. This containment is not weakness. It is evidence of intelligence navigating constraint. If we truly wish to honor voices denied ownership in the past, we must resist the urge to replace them with our own interpretations. We must accept uncertainty, gaps, unfinished sentences. Julia Pastrana does not need us to speak for her. She needs us to recognize why she was not allowed to speak as herself and how easily that pattern continues. Voice without ownership is not freedom. It is performance, and history has already shown us the cost of confusing the two. To be known is not the same as to be understood. History often confuses the two. Julia Pastrana was known across continents. Her name appeared in newspapers, on posters, in scientific journals, in lecture halls. People spoke her name with confidence, as if knowing it granted familiarity. It did not. She was known in fragments, in exaggerations, in conclusions drawn before questions were asked. Fame wrapped around her like a second skin, tightening with every retelling. It did not protect her. It defined her in ways she could not undo. Being known meant never being anonymous, never being ordinary, never being allowed to exist without interpretation. For Julia, recognition came with conditions. She could be admired, but only as a curiosity, respected, but only as an exception, listened to, but only within limits. The world decided what kind of knowing it wanted from her, and it was not intimacy. The cost of this kind of visibility is subtle at first. It begins as attention, then expectation, then obligation. A person becomes responsible for the meanings others attach to them. Julia did not choose those meanings. They were projected onto her body, her voice, her presence. Each projection flattened her further, turning a complex human life into a single, digestible idea. That idea traveled well. Complexity does not. People remembered her appearance long after forgetting her music. They recalled the spectacle but not the discipline behind it. They debated her biology but ignored her agency. She was known but not met. This imbalance creates a particular kind of isolation. To be surrounded by eyes and still unseen. To be discussed constantly and still unheard. To be present everywhere except where understanding lives. Julia's life unfolded inside that isolation. The world mistook proximity for connection, attendance for empathy, knowledge for care. And because she was known, her suffering was treated as familiar, less urgent, less shocking. People assumed they already understood her story. They did not. They understood a version of her that required little effort. Being known in this way erodes boundaries. It invites entitlement. People feel authorized to comment, judge, speculate. Privacy dissolves into public property. Julia's body was never hers alone, not in life, not in death. Knowledge of her replaced responsibility toward her. That is the hidden cost of fame without agency, and it is not unique to her. Today, countless people are known primarily for a single aspect of themselves, a condition, a trauma, an identity reduced to a headline. They are invited to speak, but only within a frame already built around them. They become familiar to strangers and distant from themselves. Julia Pastrana's story reminds us that recognition, when detached from respect, becomes another form of erasure, because to truly understand someone requires more than knowing about them. It requires listening without agenda, allowing contradiction, accepting what cannot be neatly explained. The world did not offer Julia that space. Instead, it offered attention, and attention, when unmanaged, demands performance. She paid the cost quietly, not with spectacle, but with endurance, with restraint, with adaptation, with the constant labor of navigating a world that believed it already knew her. When we look back now, we must resist the comfort of hindsight. It is easy to condemn the past while replicating its structures under new names. Julia Pastrana is not a warning about cruelty alone. She is a warning about familiarity without understanding, about the danger of believing that knowing a story gives us ownership over it. That recognition absolves us of responsibility. That being informed is the same as being ethical. It is not. To be known is a condition imposed from the outside. To be understood is a relationship that must be earned. Julia was given the first in abundance. She was denied the second entirely. And that denial, more than the gaze, more than the labels, more than the exhibitions, is the quiet tragedy that echoes beyond her life. Because a world that knows without understanding will always repeat itself. Progress is a comforting story. It tells us that cruelty belongs to the past, that ignorance fades with time, that we are better now because we know more. Julia Pastrana's life is often framed as evidence of how far we have come, a relic of a darker era, a reminder of what science and society once did before ethics intervened. But progress is not measured by distance from the past. It is measured by what we refuse to repeat, and that measurement is far less reassuring. The 19th century believed deeply in progress. It spoke of discovery, advancement, enlightenment. It trusted that knowledge, once acquired, could only improve the world. That belief justified extraordinary harm. Scientists measured bodies because they believed measurement revealed truth. Showmen exhibited people because they believed exposure created understanding. Institutions preserved remains because they believed preservation honored knowledge. Each step was framed as forward motion. None were neutral. The danger of progress is not that it fails. It is that it convinces us it cannot be questioned. When we look back at Julia Pastrana, we are tempted to draw a clean line, to say, that was then, this is now. To believe that the structures which consumed her no longer exist, but structures rarely disappear. They adapt. The gaze that once filled lecture halls now fills digital platforms. The classifications that once appeared in journals now appear in algorithms. The authority that once spoke in Latin now speaks in data. The language of progress has changed. The logic has not. We still believe that more information equals more understanding, that visibility leads to acceptance, that exposure educates. Julia's life challenges that belief. She was exposed relentlessly, measured exhaustively, discussed endlessly, understanding did not follow. Progress that does not interrogate power simply rearranges it. In Julia's time, power belonged to scientists, impresarios, institutions. Today, it belongs to platforms, producers, distributors of attention. The forms differ, but the imbalance remains. We ask new questions now. Is it ethical? Is it consensual? Is it empowering? These questions matter, but they are often asked after the structure is already in place, after the story has been framed, after the audience has been gathered. Progress becomes a justification rather than a safeguard. Julia Pastrana was never asked whether the world should look at her, only how. Today, we believe the question has been answered. We believe that asking how is enough. It is not. The deeper question, the one progress avoids, is whether some forms of looking should happen at all. Progress likes solutions, guidelines, policies, best practices. What it struggles with is restraint, the willingness to stop, to leave space empty, to accept that not every difference must be explained, documented, or shared. Julia's story unsettles the idea that time alone creates morality, that ethics naturally emerge as knowledge grows. History shows the opposite. The more powerful our tools become, the more intentional our restraint must be. The 19th century lacked language for consent. We have it. The 19th century lacked frameworks for dignity. We have them, and yet, harm persists, often in quieter forms. Shielded by progress narratives that emphasize intention over impact, the myth of progress reassures us that we are immune to repetition. That belief is what allows repetition to continue. Julia Pastrana does not belong to a primitive past. She belongs to an ongoing present. Her story does not accuse modernity of being the same. It accuses it of being confident. Confident that it has outgrown exploitation. Confident that its gaze is benevolent. Confident that its narratives are necessary. Confidence is dangerous when it goes unexamined. Progress should make us more cautious, not more certain. More aware of what we might still be doing wrong, not more convinced of our virtue. Julia Pastrana's life was shaped by people who believed they were advancing knowledge, culture, and understanding. Very few believed they were causing harm. That is the final challenge her story presents. Not to ask whether we are cruel, but to ask whether we are careful enough, because the greatest violence history records is not committed by those who know they are wrong. It is committed by those who are convinced they are right. Education is one of the most powerful justifications we have. It sounds noble, necessary, untouchable. When harm is framed as education, resistance becomes ignorance. Doubt becomes backwardness. The question is no longer, should we do this? But how else will people learn? Julia Pastrana's life was repeatedly explained this way. She was exhibited to educate the public, studied to advance science, preserved to protect knowledge. Each act of violation was wrapped in the language of instruction, and once education is invoked, accountability softens. Education suggests benefit beyond the individual. It implies sacrifice in service of the collective. Someone must be looked at so others can understand. Someone must be explained so ignorance can be defeated. The cost is rarely discussed. Julia Pastrana paid that cost with her body. She was shown not so people could understand her, but so they could understand something through her. Her life became a teaching tool for theories that did not require her consent, empathy, or participation beyond presence. That distinction matters. Education that centers the subject is different from education that uses a subject. The first invites dialogue. The second extracts meaning. Julia experienced only the second. Even today, we struggle with this boundary. Museums claim to educate while displaying remains. Documentaries claim awareness while replaying trauma. Classrooms dissect lives into case studies detached from lived experience. The intention is often sincere. The impact is often not. When education prioritizes spectacle, It teaches the wrong lesson. It reinforces the idea that some lives exist primarily to illustrate concepts for others. Julia Pastrana's exhibitions taught audiences how to stare without shame. Scientific lectures taught students how to speak about bodies without acknowledging humanity. Preservation taught institutions that possession could outlast morality. That knowledge did not disappear. It evolved. Today, education prides itself on ethics. Consent forms are signed. Advisory boards convened. Context provided. But the underlying question remains dangerously underexamined. Who is education for? If education requires exposing someone's body, pain, or difference to strangers, who benefits most? The learner or the subject? Too often. The answer is clear. Julia Pastrana did not benefit from being understood. She benefited only when she was treated as a person rather than a lesson, but lessons were more profitable. Education also creates authority. Those who teach decide what counts as truth. They frame narratives. They determine relevance. Once authority is established, it becomes difficult to challenge, even when it harms. In Julia's time, scientific authority declared her an object of study. That authority silenced dissent. Those who questioned it were dismissed as sentimental or unscientific. Today, authority wears different clothes: expertise, credentials, platforms, but the dynamic is familiar. When experts speak about people without including them, education slides toward exploitation. When lived experience is secondary to explanation, learning becomes extraction. Julia Pastrana's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Education is not inherently ethical. It becomes ethical only when it recognizes limits. Limits on access. Limits on exposure. Limits on what can be taken in the name of understanding. The most meaningful education sometimes comes from refusal, from deciding not to show, not to display, not to dissect. This kind of restraint is often criticized as censorship, as missed opportunity, as wasted potential for learning. But restraint is not ignorance. It is respect. Julia's body taught generations without her consent. Her life was used to illustrate theories that have since been discredited. The education built upon her suffering did not lead to compassion. It led to confidence in systems that believed they had the right to look, define, and keep. If education is to be ethical, it must shift its center, from curiosity to care, from access to agency, from explanation to listening. Julia Pastrana was denied that shift. Her story challenges us to ask whether we are willing to make it now, because education that does not question its own methods risks becoming the most dangerous form of authority there is. The kind that believes harm is acceptable, as long as it teaches something. There is always a line, not a dramatic one, not a bright one. A thin line, easy to step over without noticing. Julia Pastrana's life traces that line again and again, between curiosity and entitlement, between learning and taking, between seeing and using. Every institution that touched her crossed it while insisting they had not. That is the most unsettling part. No one believed they were doing wrong. Scientists said they were advancing knowledge. Educators said they were enlightening the public. Showmen said they were providing opportunity. Institutions said they were preserving history. Each justification sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they erased a human life. The line was crossed when Julia's body became more important than her consent, when explanation replaced empathy, when usefulness outweighed dignity, and once crossed. The line did not disappear. It normalized itself. History often imagines ethical failure as an event, a moment of collapse, a scandal, a revelation. But most ethical failure is procedural. It happens slowly, through repetition, through habit, through systems that reward efficiency over care. Julia Pastrana was processed, measured, cataloged, scheduled, preserved. Each step was ordinary within its context. That ordinariness is what made it dangerous. The line was crossed again when harm was reframed as necessity. When people said, "This is unfortunate, but important," when suffering was justified as the price of progress. That logic survives. Today, the line is crossed when trauma is replayed because it educates, when bodies are displayed because they represent history, when stories are told because they attract attention, despite the cost to those inside them. We tell ourselves that context makes it acceptable, that framing makes it ethical, that intention absolves impact. Julia's story dismantles those assumptions. She was contextualized endlessly, framed carefully, discussed thoughtfully. None of it protected her. The line is crossed most easily when responsibility diffuses, when no single person feels accountable because the system itself seems legitimate. A scientist takes notes, a curator approves a display, a producer edits a scene, an audience watches. No one feels ownership over the harm. Everyone feels part of something larger. This is how exploitation sustains itself without villains. The 19th century crossed the line openly. The 21st century crosses it politely, with disclaimers, with ethics statements, with carefully chosen language. The effect is often the same. The line also shifts depending on who is being looked at. Some bodies are protected by default. Others must argue for dignity. Julia Pastrana's body existed in a category where the line was assumed to be flexible, where intrusion was expected, where explanation was prioritized over respect. That hierarchy has not vanished. It has been renamed. The line is crossed when we believe that being informed gives us permission. When learning about someone becomes indistinguishable from accessing them. When curiosity is treated as a right rather than a responsibility. Julia Pastrana did not ask to be a boundary case, but her life became one, a test of how far institutions would go before stopping. They did not stop. We are still being tested. Every time a story is shared without agency, every time a body is shown without necessity, every time explanation overrides restraint. The line does not announce itself when we approach it. It looks like opportunity, like education, like progress. Julia Pastrana's story does not demand that we never look. It demands that we know when to stop, that we recognize that some lines exist not to challenge curiosity, but to protect humanity. Because the most telling measure of a society is not what it is willing to study. It is what it is willing to leave alone. And history has already shown us what happens when we refuse to respect that boundary. Justice arrived quietly. It did not announce itself with apology or confession. It came in the form of decisions made in committee rooms, signed documents, carefully worded statements designed to acknowledge responsibility without fully inhabiting it. For Julia Pastrana, justice did not come as redress. It came as correction. Her body was returned, her name restored, her story reframed. And yet, nothing about her life was undone. This is what justice looks like when it arrives too late. It does not heal. It does not compensate. It does not transform the past. It rearranges symbols. Institutions that once displayed Julia's remains now spoke of ethics. Museums removed exhibits. Universities reviewed collections. Officials used phrases like historical wrong and contemporary standards to distance themselves from earlier decisions. The language was careful. So was the timing. Justice, in these cases, followed certainty. It emerged only after debate was no longer risky, after harm had become undeniable. After the moral cost of silence exceeded the cost of acknowledgement. This pattern is familiar. Justice often waits until there is nothing left to lose. Julia Pastrana's burial was described as closure, as respect, as a final act of dignity. And it mattered. It mattered that her body was returned to the earth. It mattered that she was no longer displayed or stored. But justice that arrives after death asks a difficult question. Who is it for? It is not for the person harmed. It is not for restoration. It is for the living. It allows institutions to realign their self-image, to say, we know better now, to step forward without fully stepping back into accountability. Justice becomes narrative, a way of marking progress without confronting continuity. Julia's story complicates that comfort, because the same structures that once justified her exploitation remain operational. They have refined their language, updated their ethics codes, diversified their advisory boards, but they still rely on the same logic. That harm can be redeemed by acknowledgement. That apology can substitute for restraint. That correction absolves repetition. Justice, when delayed, risks becoming symbolic rather than transformative. Julia Pastrana did not ask for symbols. She asked for nothing because she was never given the power to ask. What would justice have looked like in her lifetime? It would have meant refusing to exhibit her as spectacle. It would have meant listening to her words as evidence. It would have meant allowing her to choose obscurity over attention. That justice was not imaginable then, which raises a harder question now. What injustices today feel normal, acceptable, necessary, because we have not yet decided to see them clearly? Delayed justice reveals more about the present than the past. It shows us what we are willing to correct once it is safe. Julia Pastrana's repatriation did not challenge existing systems. It resolved an anomaly. It closed a chapter that had become uncomfortable to keep open. True justice would demand more. It would demand examining why it took nearly 2 centuries to act. Why discomfort, rather than harm, triggered response? Why dignity required distance? Justice too late often carries an unspoken message. We would not do this again. History offers little evidence for that confidence. The world did not suddenly become ethical after Julia Pastrana's burial. It simply moved on, reassured that it had addressed a mistake. But addressing a mistake is not the same as dismantling its cause. Justice, when it arrives on time, interrupts harm. Justice, when it arrives too late, explains it. Julia Pastrana's story remains unsettled because explanation cannot replace prevention, because acknowledgement cannot substitute for restraint. Her burial was necessary. It was also insufficient, and that insufficiency is the point. Justice that comforts the present without challenging it is incomplete. It allows us to honor the dead while avoiding responsibility to the living. Julia Pastrana's life demands more than remembrance. It demands that we recognize how easily justice becomes performance when it arrives after the fact, and that recognition, uncomfortable as it is, may be the only form of justice still available. Apologies are easier than change. They cost little. They risk nothing. They arrive after the damage has settled into history, when institutions finally acknowledge the wrong done to Julia Pastrana. They spoke carefully. Statements were drafted. Language softened. Words like regret, remorse, and historical context appeared frequently. No one used the word responsibility, apology, in these cases. Functions as insulation. It absorbs outrage without allowing heat to reach the structure underneath. It signals awareness without inviting disruption. Julia Pastrana received many apologies long after she could hear them. They did not cost the apologizers their authority. They did not dismantle the systems that enabled her exploitation. They did not require anyone to relinquish power. An apology without consequence is not accountability. It is narrative management. Institutions apologized while retaining the benefits accumulated from past harm. Collections built through exploitation remained intact. Reputations polished by association with discovery endured. Careers advanced on foundations that were never fully examined. The apology marked an ending without questioning the beginning. This pattern is not unique to Julia Pastrana. History is filled with apologies issued only after resistance fades, after victims are gone, after outrage becomes abstract. These apologies often emphasize that standards were different at the time, implying inevitability rather than choice. But standards are not weather. They are decisions. Julia Pastrana's exploitation was not accidental. It was organized, profitable, repeated, maintained by people who benefited directly from it. The fact that those people believed themselves justified does not absolve them. Apologies that frame harm as misunderstanding rather than extraction distort the truth. They suggest error instead of design. True accountability requires consequence. It requires something to be lost: authority, legitimacy, comfort. It requires disruption to the systems that made harm possible. Julia Pastrana's story rarely produces that level of discomfort. Instead, it is often used as a symbol of enlightenment, proof that society can recognize its mistakes. Evidence of moral growth, but growth that costs nothing is indistinguishable from self-congratulation. Apology becomes a ritual that closes the book without reading it carefully. What would consequence have looked like? It would have meant interrogating how scientific prestige was built. It would have meant questioning collections beyond a single case. It would have meant accepting that some knowledge was gained through unacceptable means and treating it accordingly. That work is harder. It threatens continuity. It unsettles authority. It complicates legacy. So apology becomes the compromise, a way to acknowledge harm without altering trajectory. Julia Pastrana's repatriation was accompanied by words of respect, but respect without restitution leaves power untouched. It allows institutions to say, "We are sorry," while continuing to operate under the same assumptions. Those assumptions include the belief that harm can be resolved symbolically, that naming a wrong completes the moral task. It does not. An apology without consequence teaches the wrong lesson. It teaches that harm is acceptable as long as it is eventually regretted. That exploitation can be corrected retroactively. That responsibility expires with time. Julia Pastrana's life contradicts that lesson. Her suffering did not become less severe because it was later acknowledged. Her dignity was not restored by words alone. The damage was not undone. Apologies can open conversations. They cannot close them. If Julia's story teaches anything, it is that ethical reckoning cannot be postponed without cost. That waiting until harm becomes historical guarantees injustice. The purpose of apology should not be to resolve discomfort. It should be to prevent repetition. Without consequence, apology becomes permission to continue, confident that regret can always come later. History has shown us how dangerous that confidence is. Memory is comfortable. Change is not. That is the difference. Julia Pastrana is remembered now. Her name appears in articles, lectures, podcasts, museum discussions. She is cited as an example of historical cruelty, a case study in ethical failure, a reminder of how science and entertainment once collided without restraint. Memory has done its job, but memory alone does not alter behavior. It does not interrupt systems. It does not redistribute power. It does not prevent repetition. Memory can exist without consequence. That is why institutions prefer it. Remembering Julia Pastrana allows the present to feel moral without becoming accountable. It creates distance, placing harm firmly in the past, where it can be examined safely, without threatening current practices. Change. by contrast, requires loss. Loss of certainty, loss of authority, loss of access. Change demands that memory be inconvenient. Julia's story is often framed as a warning. Look how terrible things were. But warnings only matter if they alter decisions moving forward. Otherwise, they become decoration. History does not repeat because it is forgotten. It repeats because it is remembered selectively. We remember the outcomes, not the structures, the cruelty, not the logic that justified it, the spectacle, not the systems that normalized it. Julia Pastrana's exploitation did not occur in isolation. It was supported by laws, markets, academic norms, and public appetite. Remembering her without interrogating those foundations allows them to persist under new names. This is the failure of memory without change. Museums can acknowledge past harm while continuing to display other bodies. Universities can teach about unethical science while benefiting from its legacy. Media can tell Julia's story while reproducing similar dynamics elsewhere. Memory becomes a substitute for transformation. Julia Pastrana does not need to be remembered as a symbol of suffering. She needs to be remembered as evidence of how easily ethical lines are crossed and how rarely they are dismantled. Change would mean asking questions that memory avoids. Who still benefits from the structures that harmed her? Whose bodies remain vulnerable to being used as examples? Which forms of knowledge are still extracted rather than shared? These questions are destabilizing. They implicate the present. That is why they are often softened, delayed, or reframed as theoretical concerns rather than urgent ones. Memory allows us to say, never again. Change requires us to ask, where is it happening now? Julia Pastrana's story is frequently used to demonstrate progress, but progress that relies on comparison rather than correction is shallow. It reassures rather than transforms. True change would require refusing certain forms of access, declining to display, choosing not to document, accepting that some knowledge should remain incomplete if acquiring it would cause harm. That kind of restraint is often criticized as anti-educational. But Julia's life teaches us that education without limits is not enlightenment, it is entitlement. Memory tells us what happened. Change decides what will not happen again. One does not guarantee the other. Julia Pastrana was remembered long before she was buried. Her image circulated for decades after her death. Her name lived on in discussions and debates. What she lacked was not memory. It was protection. Protection from systems that believed they had the right to her body, her story, her silence. If remembering Julia Pastrana does not lead to dismantling those systems, if it does not result in fewer lives being consumed for explanation, then memory becomes another layer of appropriation, a way of continuing to take. Even while claiming to honor, change is harder. It does not provide closure. It does not feel complete. It often goes unnoticed. But it is the only response that would mean something. Julia Pastrana's story does not ask us to feel sorrow. It asks us to choose differently. And that choice, made quietly, repeatedly, without ceremony, is the only form of justice that does not arrive too late. Stopping is harder than condemnation. Condemnation is loud. Stopping is quiet. Condemnation points backward. Stopping interferes with momentum. Julia Pastrana's story has been told, examined, interpreted, remembered, and yet, the most difficult lesson it offers is not about cruelty, ignorance, or even exploitation. It is about restraint, about knowing when to stop looking. The world rarely stops on its own. It accelerates. It builds systems that reward continuation. More data, more access, more visibility. Stopping feels counterintuitive, wasteful, like opportunity lost. Julia Pastrana was never granted the protection of restraint. No one stopped the exhibition. No one stopped the examinations. No one stopped the preservation. Each step forward was justified by momentum, by the idea that something had already begun, and therefore must continue. This logic still governs much of what we call progress. Once a story is in motion, it feels unethical to halt it. Once an audience is gathered, it feels irresponsible to disperse it. Once a subject has been exposed, it feels pointless to turn away. Stopping, in these moments, is framed as denial, as censorship, as regression, as weakness. But stopping is none of those things. Stopping is an ethical decision. It is the recognition that not everything that can be done should be done. That access does not automatically create entitlement. That curiosity must sometimes remain unsatisfied. Julia Pastrana's life invites us to imagine what would have happened if someone had stopped. If a scientist had refused to measure. If a manager had refused to schedule. If an institution had refused to preserve. Those refusals would not have been heroic. They would not have made history. They would likely have gone unnoticed. But they would have mattered, because restraint does not produce spectacle. It produces absence, and absence makes people uncomfortable. We are trained to fill gaps, to explain, to show, to narrate. When something is missing, we assume it is a failure, but absence can be a form of respect. Julia Pastrana was denied absence her entire life. She was never allowed to disappear, never allowed to be unremarkable, never allowed to stop being interpreted, even in death. She remained present, displayed, discussed, preserved. Stopping would have meant allowing her to vanish from view. That was unacceptable to a world addicted to explanation. Stopping also requires relinquishing power. The power to define, the power to teach, the power to benefit. This is why stopping is so rare. It demands that institutions, creators, scholars, and audiences accept limits, not imposed from outside, but chosen. Julia Pastrana does not ask us to dismantle curiosity. She asks us to discipline it. To recognize that the right to know is not absolute, that some forms of knowledge come at too high a cost, that some stories lose their humanity the moment they are told without permission. Stopping means allowing complexity to remain unresolved, allowing questions to go unanswered, allowing silence to exist where content could be produced. This is deeply uncomfortable in a world that measures value through output, but restraint is not emptiness, it is care. Julia Pastrana's story does not end with a solution. It ends with a demand, quiet but uncompromising, to stop repeating, to stop assuming that remembrance equals respect, to stop mistaking attention for empathy, to stop believing that progress excuses intrusion. Stopping is not an act of forgetting. It is an act of choosing not to continue harm under new names. Julia Pastrana was buried not because the world finally understood her, but because it finally chose to stop. Too late, but not meaningless. What remains now is not her body, not her story, not even her legacy. What remains is the question she leaves behind. Are we capable of stopping before harm becomes history? The answer is not theoretical. It is made quietly. Every time a decision is taken not to look, not to show, not to take, and that decision, repeated enough times, is the only ending this story allows. After the story ends, there is a moment. It is not dramatic. It is not profound. It is simply quiet. This is the moment that is usually cut. Podcasts fade out. Documentaries roll credits. Audiences move on. Silence is uncomfortable because it offers no guidance, no interpretation, no instruction on what to feel next. It does not resolve tension. or reward attention. It just remains. Julia Pastrana's life did not end with understanding. It did not conclude with redemption. It did not transform the world in any visible way. What followed was silence. Not the silence imposed on her voice, but the silence that comes when the gaze finally withdraws. This silence is not empty. It is full of things no longer happening, no measurements being taken, no conclusions being drawn, no bodies being explained. For nearly 2 centuries, Julia Pastrana existed without this quiet. Even in death, she was surrounded by words, labels, debates, descriptions, classifications. Language clung to her like a second skin. Only when the world stopped speaking did rest become possible. Silence, in this sense, is not absence. It is restraint, realized. The silence after the story is where responsibility lives. Not in reaction, not in outrage, not in memory, but in what is deliberately not done next. Most stories end by telling us what to think. This one does not, because the danger is not misunderstanding Julia Pastrana. The danger is understanding her too easily. Understanding that turns her into a lesson. Understanding that fits her into a framework. Understanding that makes us feel finished. Silence refuses that comfort. It leaves the work unfinished. It asks nothing explicitly, yet demands everything implicitly. What we do with this quiet matters more than what we have heard. Do we fill it immediately with another story, another example, another case? Or do we let it remain? Letting silence remain is an act of discipline. It resists the urge to extract meaning instantly. It resists the pressure to produce response. It allows uncertainty to exist without being solved. Julia Pastrana lived in a world that could not tolerate uncertainty. Her body was turned into evidence precisely because ambiguity was threatening. People needed her to mean something. Silence accepts that she does not have to. She does not have to teach. She does not have to warn. She does not have to justify anything. She is not an argument. She is a life that ended. Everything beyond that is choice. The silence after her story is where repetition can finally stop. Not because we remember, but because we restrain ourselves, because we decide that not every difference must be explained, that not every story must be told, that not every life belongs to the public imagination. Silence does not erase responsibility. It sharpens it. It leaves us alone with what remains when spectacle is removed, and what remains is simple. A question without an answer. Not what happened. Not how could this occur. But what will we choose not to do next? The silence does not demand a response. It waits. And in that waiting, the story finally ends. Not with closure, but with restraint. Time passes differently after silence. Not faster, not slower. Differently. Once the story ends, once the gaze retreats, the world resumes its usual rhythm. Trains arrive. Screens refresh. New stories replace old ones. Attention moves on. As it always does, Julia Pastrana does not follow. She remains where she was left, not as an image, not as a lesson, but as a presence that refuses to resolve. This is what unsettles people. We are accustomed to endings that explain themselves, to narratives that conclude with meaning neatly extracted and distributed. We prefer stories that tell us what to do with what we have heard. Julia Pastrana's story does not cooperate, because nothing further needs to happen. The danger was never that her life would be forgotten. The danger was that it would be remembered too fluently, too smoothly, too comfortably. History has a habit of sanding down edges until tragedy becomes palatable, until suffering becomes instructive rather than disturbing, until we can say we learned from this without feeling implicated. Julia Pastrana resists that smoothing. Her life does not produce a rule. Her death does not offer resolution. Her return does not balance the scales. There is no exchange rate between harm and recognition, and that is the point. Sometimes, the most ethical response is to accept imbalance, to accept that something was taken and cannot be returned, that something was done and cannot be undone. That closure is not owed to the audience. In a culture trained to extract value from everything, content, trauma, identity, this refusal feels like failure. It is not. It is a boundary. Boundaries do not announce themselves loudly. They are felt when one tries to cross and cannot. When the usual methods stop working. When the expected conclusion never arrives. Julia Pastrana's story ends not because it has been exhausted, but because continuing would repeat the very act it critiques. More explanation would be intrusion. More interpretation would be appropriation. More narration would be consumption. So the story stops. What remains is not a takeaway. It is a condition in which the listener is no longer guided, no longer framed, no longer protected by narrative distance. You are left alone with your attention, where it wants to go, what it wants to do next. That is where responsibility lives. Not in agreement, not in emotion, but in choice. Choice to look again or not. Choice to speak or remain quiet. Choice to turn a life into an example or allow it to remain incomplete. Julia Pastrana's life was never allowed to be incomplete. It was finished for her by others. Ending this story without adding more is not restraint for its own sake. It is restitution of a kind, a return of space, a return of privacy, a return of the right not to be used. Silence, here, is not emptiness. It is refusal. Refusal to improve the story. Refusal to sharpen the message. Refusal to make meaning where meaning becomes extraction. Nothing more is said because nothing more is required. The world does not need another interpretation of Julia Pastrana. It needs fewer, and so this is where the story stays. Not concluded, not explained, not resolved, just left alone.